Thank you so much for being here. This is our 5th and final event of our first ever Cello Fest. So thank you so much for being a part of it. So Cello Fest exists because we have a crazy number of cellists associated with our music department at Cal Poly. And I say associated because most of those cellists are non-majors, which is incredible. They're doing it because they really just love the cello. But we also have a fantastic music major that just gave her recital on Friday as part of Cello Fest. We had 3 cellists, which were all non-majors, performing in the master class for the principal cellist of the San Francisco Ballet on Thursday. They did an amazing job. And then we had an incredible cello ensemble concert yesterday, where we had 13 cellists, 11 of them were non-majors, performing in their first ever full concert, which was fantastic. So as just a reminder, please silence your devices before we begin. All right, and I don't know if everyone has a program. We might have run out of programs. So I'm going to talk kind of a little bit in between, just so you know what's coming up. The first piece I'm playing is the second suite by Max Reger. And I think it's helpful to talk a little bit about how these pieces were selected. So when I was going through the whole programming process, I was talking to my mother-in-law, Jane Cohen. Many of you know who she is. And I tend to pick pieces that are dark and sad. I really like that. And she was really fearing that it was just a little too heavy given current events and the venue and all these things. And after falling in love with a couple of these pieces, I ended up realizing that some of these things are made even more special. The beautiful moments are special when they come from the darkness that we experience together. I think that they feel different when they're surrounded by all of the different layers of complexity. So I encourage you to listen for that in this first piece. He was actually very well celebrated by Leonard Rose and Janos Starker, for those who know their cellists. He was quoted to be the greatest cello theoretician in the world, according to Leonard Rose. These pieces, and most of the things he wrote, were from a more educational kind of standpoint, so they were a bit easier, but I actually programmed them on this piece because, or on this program, I'm sorry, because of course the name, In Search of Light, it kind of works with lights and shadows, but I needed a break in the program because that is a very physical piece, and so are the other two on the program, but accidentally, these are also very intense, just in the character alone. So they're simple, but they're really beautiful. And it's funny because as I was working on this, I was trying to figure out where are the shadows and the lights in this piece, and I don't feel like it's necessarily as easy to identify unless you picture it visually. So I kind of imagine a foggy forest where there are beams of light kind of shooting through, and I like to try to look for where those beams of light are in each of the movements. class I did not talk about, and it's because it's related to this piece on the program. The next piece is Sarabande in 7/8 by Dr. Aaron Klein, who's sitting right in the front here. So in that talk, we had a lot of conversation about so I'm the third performer of this piece, and so how it's evolved over the different performances, and how he wrote it, and all the difficulties of writing for solo cello. So it's a pretty interesting one. He's also writing a sarabande, which has a lot of history behind it. So it's very popular in the Baroque era. It's often featured in the Bach cello suites, or it's always featured in the Bach cello suites, which brings me to maybe an important point, that the elephant in the room, that the only thing that's really not on this program that should be is Bach. And so it's very rare for a solo cello recital not to have Bach on it. But I really fell in love with these pieces, and I thought that they really, they were perfect together and great without Bach by themselves. So they're all kind of a response. No one writes a suite or a sarabande without having Bach in mind in some way. And so I think it'll be interesting to listen for the ways that this was inspired by Bach and the ways that it deviates from Bach. Oh, and somebody actually asked me to talk about this. So it's in 7/8, that's the time signature. So the reason why Dr. Klein wrote it in 7/8 is because sarabandes typically have an elongated or maybe a more relaxed beat too. We tend to take a little bit of time. That's where the emphasis lies in the music. And so he really exploited that by adding a whole extra eighth note to that middle beat. So for a musician, this is 2 + 3 + 2. And he sent it, and I was looking at programming a piece that I was playing. I'm in a contemporary chamber ensemble in San Francisco, and so I play a lot of different new music solos and things like that that are easier than that. But nothing fit on the program in the same way. And so he showed me this piece, and we had a lot of talk about the word athletic. But I hope you love the work as much as I do. So the last piece on the program is the one that I think I picked first. I really fell in love with this piece. It's not a very common piece. Nothing on the program is very common, but this one for sure is not a very common piece to perform. Bloch was a Swiss Jewish composer that ended up moving to the Bay Area and taught at Berkeley until 1952. So there's a lot of different connections there. And he actually was quoted to say that he felt that to write music that expressed his Jewish identity was the only way in which he could produce music of vitality and significance. So this piece is not as obvious in hearing a lot of those Jewish melodies as some of his other pieces like Shlomo or From Jewish Life, but you'll still pick up on little elements here and there, of course, a lot of modal things that you might recognize. Enjoy. From Jewish Life by Bloch called The Prayer. Normally this would be with piano, but